How did the Cold War get started? That's what we need to focus on in today's video. After the war, when Hitler surrendered and the war in Europe was over, everybody thought that Russia and the United States and Britain would continue a three-way cooperation, and that cooperation among the three great powers would determine how the world ran and would provide peace in our time, as Chamberlain said. But it didn't work out that way, obviously. The US and Britain went one way and Russia went the other way, and the Cold War replaced World War II as the central dynamic of our foreign policy. How did that happen? During World War II, Stalin was seen as a friendly, avuncular figure. In fact, FDR called him Uncle Joe. And throughout the American media, Russia was treated with tremendous deference and respect. First, a lot of the media were communists in the 30s and sided with Russia back then, alienated by the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, but went back to being Russia fans after Hitler invaded Russia. And they gave Stalin tremendous credit, which he deserved, for essentially bearing the brunt of the combat in World War II. But it became apparent as soon as the Soviet troops arrived in Eastern Europe, primarily in Poland, which has the bulk of the population of Eastern Europe, that Stalin intended to impose a Soviet dictatorship in Poland, not permit free elections, and essentially destroy the chances of democracy in Poland. Why was Poland so important to us? Well, we went into World War II because of Poland. It was to protect Poland that Britain and France declared war on Germany. They put up with his taking over Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland and all that, but when he invaded Poland, that was a line in the sand that he couldn't cross. And that led to the World War. And now here was Stalin giving it all away and creating a dictatorship in Poland. In fact, he even went to the lengths in 1944, as the Russians were advancing toward Berlin, of pausing on the Vistula River, right at the edge of Warsaw. And he sent a message to the Polish resistance and said, "Rise, you rise up from within, we'll attack from without, and we'll make short work of the Germans." And the Polish resistance did. And the Russians sat there and did nothing for 6 months and let the Nazis wipe out the Polish resistance. And then they walked in and defeated the Nazis and took over Warsaw. Why? Because Stalin wanted to eliminate any possibility of democratic forces remaining in Poland. And we now know that at Katyn Forest, the Russians massacred the entire Polish officer corps. As many as 20,000 Polish officers were massacred and blamed it on the Nazis when the bodies were found. So as soon as the war ended, it became clear that Russia was not going to permit free elections. Truman and Churchill went to Potsdam to a conference in 1946 to urge him to give to urge him to have free elections in Poland, but he wasn't budging. He kept giving them lip service and nothing really happened. And it became increasingly clear as 1946 went on that Russia was intent on establishing dominion over Eastern Europe. Churchill went to Fulton, Missouri, and said an iron curtain has descended across Europe, behind which these countries are now enslaved to the Soviet Union. It was a new concept for the American people. We weren't used to it, and it initially met with a great deal of resistance. Many of the liberals who had backed Franklin Roosevelt and were very much involved in the New Deal were themselves either communists or sympathetic to the communists, and were not taking it lightly that we were turning against Russia. They rallied together behind Henry Wallace, the vice president right before Truman, who narrowly missed being president because he left office a month before FDR died. And Wallace set up the Progressive Party, which was essentially aligned with the Soviet Union, and said, if only you stop challenging them, you stop getting in their face, you start being willing to work with them, you stop listening to these strident anti-communists, then there wouldn't be a Cold War, everything would be fine. And eventually we saw how ludicrous that position was, and he was sharply rejected in the 1948 election. As 46 evolved and went into 47, there was more and more disenchantment with Russia, a greater feeling that Russia was not living up to its word. And here came one of the most important moments in U.S. history. From 1945 until 1949, the United States was the only country in the world that had the atomic bomb. We could have used it on Russia. We could have told them, you back off Eastern Europe, or we're going to drop atomic bombs on your territory. And Russia would have had no defense to it, no capacity for retaliation. Instead, we didn't do it. And Truman said, let's put the atomic bomb under UN auspices and let the United Nations control it. And the Russians were the ones who opposed it because they wanted their own atomic bomb to retaliate against the United States. Well, as we got used to the idea that the Cold War was starting, that there was a new conflict upon us, we got together and took action to save Europe from going communist. And that's what we'll talk about in next week's video. Thanks.